Hello, I'm Tim Jones, and in this session I'm going to talk to you about variation in practice. This is the third talk from session 1 about resource scarcity. The first, and perhaps obvious thing to say, is that we see variation everywhere. On the left is a graph showing variation in height for women and men in Europe, North America, East Asia, and Australia. As you would expect, there's a decent amount of variation in height, which may be due to how tall your parents are, nutrition, environment, and some other things as well. On the right hand side is a graph showing variation in the use of hip replacement in different areas of England from around 10 years ago. You can see there is a fairly broad variation, with some areas having over 200 hip replacements per 100,000 population, and some having less than 20. Again, this may be due to various factors, such as the particular characteristics of people in the area, such as their age, the prevalence of particular conditions like osteoarthritis, and of most interest to us, choices made within the health system. This could be by commissioners in the area, particular hospitals, or particular clinicians. It's also worth saying that not all variation is bad. It makes sense, for example, that an area with an older population would have more hip replacements than an area with a younger population. However, variation that is due to choices within the health system that go beyond clinical need are more open to question. Are those choices correct? What are the appropriate choices to make, given we have limited resources and want to use them as wisely as possible to maximize good patient care? Why do some areas make different choices to others? As Gareth has outlined, if we use our resources in one area of healthcare, they're not available to be used elsewhere, and we want to make the best decisions to maximize the health of our population. A good start for evidence collection is to describe the variation for different treatments. Jack Wemberg is a pioneer in this area. Wemberg's research on the issue of unwarranted variation in practice has been sustained and hugely influential, which is evident in the work of the Dartmouth Institute. One example is the Dartmouth Atlas of Healthcare, which was first published in 1996 and uses Medicare data to examine variation in the supply and delivery of care across the US. This approach has been developed into an extensive online resource. Building on this, for example, the 2003 study led by Elliot Fisher found that Medicare patients in high-spending regions of the US don't have better outcomes and aren't more satisfied with their care than patients in lower-spending regions. The NHS Right Care programme, led by Sir Muir Gray and Philip De Silva, published its first NHS Atlas of Variation, inspired by the Dartmouth approach, in November 2010. The 2016 edition of the Atlas was published with Public Health England. Here we show the directly standardised rate of elective admissions for tonsillectomy in children at CCG level in 2012-13. This ranged from 84 to 485 per 100,000 population, a 5.7-fold variation. The commentary expresses caution about whether the lowest rates may represent inappropriate unmet need, and this is left for clinicians to investigate. So the implication is that high rates represent overuse, but the atlases carefully avoid labelling local performance as good or bad. So how have commissioners responded to the publication of the Atlases of Variation? Well, Gwyn Bevan led a survey of PCT chief executives following the publication of the first atlas, to which only a minority responded. Of those that did, nearly half hadn't used the atlas, and a number of issues were cited. Clearly, being aware of its publication was not sufficient. Its relevance to decision-making was not necessarily evident. Deciding whether local experience was associated with unwarranted variation was not straightforward, let alone then instigating action to change clinical practice. RightCare sought to go further, to review indicative data to highlight the top priorities or opportunities for transformation and improvement. This use of routine data is the basis of what they referred to as the where to look phase, which is meant to lead to change in practice. This process was initially called commissioning for value, but is now labelled as the NHS RightCare Data Packs, one of the NHS RightCare intelligence products. All of these resources are available from the NHS England website. The key characteristic of the data pack analysis is to benchmark CCG level performance measures against a comparator group comprising 10 CCGs with the most similar population characteristics. You can see here that 11 criteria are used, and of these, the index of multiple deprivation is the most influential factor. Shown here are the 10 CCGs that make up the comparator group for Bristol, North Somerset and South Gloucestershire CCG. So, for example, if the spend on cancer elective admissions, the top row shown here, is significantly greater than the average spend for the 10 comparator CCGs, this is identified as potentially unwarranted high activity, for which the difference is expressed as a possible saving. It's worth noting that the scale here is in thousands of pounds. So in this case, this opportunity value is £2.9 million, shown in blue, based on 2017-18 activity. They also make a comparison with the mean spend for the 5 CCGs in the comparator group with the lowest spend. So for cancer elective admissions, this opportunity value, shown in red, is an additional £1.7 million. The comparisons made have increased with each edition and are extensive, using ever wider sources of routine data. So not just elective and non-elective admissions, outpatients, primary care prescribing, but also measures of quality and outcomes including mortality. This page, for example, reports the opportunity for QALY gains for knee and hip replacements. So it's indicating here that if BNSSG matched its 10 comparator average for QALY gains from hip replacement surgery, the bottom row, estimated from the National PROMS EQ5D data, then it could generate an additional 82 QALYs over a year. The appropriate commissioner response to this finding is not straightforward. For example, one way to increase the local mean QALY gain from hip replacement surgery would be to delay access to the surgery. This is because the longer patients wait, the more their EQ5D will deteriorate, and the greater the subsequent post-surgery gain in health-related quality of life. This reasoning would obviously be problematic. And in fact, there are almost no published examples of how commissioners have responded to the extensive data pack analysis produced by NHS RightCare. However, I can draw your attention to this example published in the Health Services Journal, the HSJ. In January 2017, the Royal College of Surgeons was reported to have stated that there was no clinical justification for 3 CCGs to change the eligibility threshold for hip and knee replacements in order to reduce the number of patients receiving surgery, which was associated with a £2 million saving. 2 weeks later, the HSJ reported that the CCG's decision was based using RightCare to identify opportunities for reducing the spend on hip and knee surgery. The argument was that the data packs indicated the CCGs commissioned 300 more hip and 53 more knee operations than the similar CCGs. Reducing activity by this amount would reduce the spend by £2.1 million and be in line with the peer CCGs. The Royal College of Surgeons was adamant that the RightCare data are not meant to be used to determine a target number for particular procedures in an area, as it's almost impossible to say what the right number should be. This view was not accepted by NHS England, which stated that in the face of rising activity and meaningful variations, CCGs are right to tackle those, and RightCare helps them to do so. Clearly, there are different perspectives being represented by these stakeholders, but no CCG wishes to court adverse publicity about rationing decisions, and in this case, the role of the RightCare analysis has not been accepted by the surgeons. It suggests to me that CCGs may think twice before claiming RightCare analysis as justification for their decision making. And so we come back to the point that describing variation in practice is not enough. Where we see variation in practice after adjusting for things like age, sex, deprivation, and disease prevalence, this may indicate some uncertainty about the most appropriate treatment. Here we see some treatments on the right of the graph, such as removal of a kidney, that don't have much geographical variation. Presumably, there is a strong clinical consensus about the need to remove a kidney, and there aren't many other options for treatment. However, there is much more variation in the treatments on the left, even after adjustment for demographics and clinical need. This seems to be more about different choices of treatment. As in the HSJ example, we can't necessarily expect everyone to adjust their practice to the overall average, or to the lowest rate, because it's not clear that this is providing the most appropriate care. One issue that is clear is that we need to improve the evidence base for medical treatments. This pie chart describes an estimate of the evidence base for all medical treatments when it was created around 10 years ago. It's concerning that over half of the pie chart is the grey colour for unknown effectiveness. One of our jobs as researchers is to increase this evidence base to help doctors who have to make decisions every day about treatments for their patients, and commissioners who have a key leadership role. In summary, variation in medical practice is a key characteristic of healthcare provision, and the extent of apparently unwarranted variation is so large that it needs to be addressed. That is, if we aspire to optimal use of the available resources. National NHS programmes such as RightCare seek to support commissioners, but it doesn't appear that this approach is sufficient. While there is a clear need to generate more evidence about the clinical and cost effectiveness of medical interventions, there is also a wider role for health economics to support closer engagement between doctors, patients and commissioners in each locality to achieve changes in historical patterns of healthcare. And that concludes the third talk from session 1 about resource scarcity. Here I provide some references which I hope will be useful.